Welcome back, 546 on Daybreak, and remembering the opening of a big development downtown, one of the fastest sellouts for a concert in Buffalo, and the one that got away, but not for long.
Channel 2's Dave McKinley looks back to when those stories and more were all news to you.
10 years ago this week was when we were just starting to hear about a new twist to something insidious, sinister, and deadly affecting our community, which we hear about all the time in the news today.
And now some genius decided to spike the heroin with fentanyl.
A plan was floated to spend up to $6 billion to bring high-speed rail upstate. So far, it's gone nowhere, and the cost adjusted for inflation would be closer to $10 billion today. And whoa, baby, look at what we found when trolling the archives in search of stories from this week in 2014. 20 years ago this week, as controversy over the movie The Passion of the Christ raged, an association started to be drawn between NASCAR fans and Republicans. So much so that the GOP started holding get-out-the-vote rallies and sending their candidates to the tracks. Smoking was being blotted out in bingo halls, although at the time you could apply for a waiver if you built a separate ventilated room. Otherwise, it was time to step outside.
And then I have to stand outside and freeze.
Cigarettes don't kill us, it's damn cold. Yeah, really.
And with online sales just coming into vogue, someone in New York City decided to try and sell their phone number, which was 867-5309. Silly idea, not when you see what some people were willing to pay for it this week in 2004. 30 years ago this week, before you could buy concert tickets online, you had to line up and get them down at the Aud. And when tickets for Garth Brooks went on sale, they sold out in an hour, which promoters said was the fastest concert sellout here in history. Another show was added for the next night. It sold out in just an hour and 15 minutes. Oh, and by the way, a ticket to see Garth Brooks back then went for $17.75. You'd be lucky to get one for 10 times that amount today. And speaking of rising costs, 30 years ago, the Buffalo Public Schools proposed budget came in at a record $365 million. It is more than $1.1 billion today. And the Winter Olympics opened in Lillehammer, Norway this week in 1994. 40 years ago this week.
It's hard to lose a job.
As the grizzled faces of factory workers leaving their jobs for a final time was emblematic of a too often told tale of that era of another plant closing, there was a sign of a different type of a story developing downtown. In fact, all they had to do was affix it to a building which civic leaders said signaled a rebirth for Buffalo. This week's News to You pop quiz, do you recognize this sign and what business it signified, which was ready for a much anticipated opening this week? 4 decades ago. Not far from there, outside the federal courthouse, where Bill's running back Joe Cribbs was ready to testify in a well-chronicled civil suit, and where, inside, they still respected the First Amendment and allowed news cameras into the lobby, Cribbs was being sued by team owner Ralph Wilson, who claimed Cribbs violated a right of first refusal clause in his contract when he signed with the Birmingham Stallions. Cribbs' lawyers argued that the clause only pertained to NFL teams, not those in the USFL. Cribbs won and was soon to join the Birmingham Stallions in time for the inaugural USFL season, where training camps were already underway and where, at one being held outside of Houston, Texas, another guy who didn't think much of playing in Buffalo for the Bills who drafted him was preparing to start his professional career, although his feeling about this area would eventually change, and quite drastically so, from how he felt about things this week in 1984 when it was all news to you.
And so here's the answer to this week's News to You pop quiz. That sign that you saw there was being affixed to the brand new Hyatt Regency Hotel in downtown Buffalo, which opened 40 years ago this week. $41 million was spent to redevelop the former Genesee building into the new hotel, where room rates were $45 a night. And when the Hyatt welcomed its very first guests this week in 1984.
Jimmy Griffin, looking good.
And thanks to Dave McKinley for pulling up that video of me about to give birth to Elliot 10 years ago. That was at the Hunter's Hope
in February,
event in February around Valentine's Day, which is Jim Kelly's birthday. So it's funny that Jim Kelly was
And
there
Elliot's
too.
birthday is?
March 9th.
Oh my gosh, so you were like a month out.
Yes, and I actually worked Daybreak the day that I gave birth to Elliot.
Trooper.
Yes.
Real trooper.
That's a good work ethic, right?
That is cool.